Back in March 2017, AMD changed the industry significantly for not only its course of being a competitor against Intel, but also for us as customers and what we expected from our processors. Prior to this date, CPU cores had been stuck on 4 cores, with CPUs such as the Q6600 released in 2007 really starting this paradigm which just continued for multiple generations thereafter. CPUs such as the 2600K as well as the 4770K would also remain at 4 cores, but at least would benefit from Intel's hyper-threading technology. Now, depending on how you look at it, and I'll leave it to you guys to argue down below, you could also look at processors such as AMD's Bulldozer lineup as higher than 4 cores. It offered an 8-core solution, but again, I'll leave you guys to argue whether it was 8 cores or not. And there was also HEDT options from Intel as well, such as the 3970X, which I think was a Sandy Bridge E processor. The problem with HEDT, of course, is that one, the platform itself is much more expensive, and well, that includes the memory that you need to operate it, but also the CPUs themselves were also much more expensive than the desktop counterparts. I believe it was a 6-core CPU, and it was something like $1,000 MSRP, which is a lot of cash. But, like I said, in March 2017 everything changed with the introduction of the Ryzen 1000 series, and we had the 1600X, for example, bumping things up to 6 cores, and the 1700X took things all the way up to 8 cores, and while, yes, it was of course still a factor for single thread performance, particularly in games, which meant that CPUs such as the 7700K would probably have an advantage in many game scenarios. It's hard to argue that the market just really pivoted. And since then, AMD then bumped the core counts up further still, with 16 cores for the Ryzen 3000 series, and of course we've seen what's happened with Intel. So the real question is, what is going on with the future of both AMD and Intel? Will we see an increase in core counts for the Zen 6 processors and also Intel's Nova Lake? Well, the answer becomes a little complicated, and we're going to get into all of it after this quick message from the sponsor of the video. Whokeys.com is a trusted and reliable way to save money on Windows 10, Windows 11 keys, as well as Microsoft Office and tons of games coming out on the PC. Let's face it, there are lots of hardware releases over the next couple of months, including all of the Zen 5X 3D parts. We've had Intel's Arrow Lake, plus new graphics cards such as RDNA 4 and RTX 50 are on the horizon, so there's a good chance that you may want to be upgrading for yourself or perhaps a loved one over the Christmas period or early next year, so now is a great time to buy. And I personally use Whokeys for my own copies of Windows 10 as well as other software. Right now, their Black Friday sale offers even bigger savings. You'll find discounts on Windows 10, Windows 11, Microsoft Office, as well as game keys. Plus, you can use our promo code, which is RGT, for an additional discount across their already reduced software range. As a good example, the Windows 11 Pro official price is $199, but using our exclusive code, you can pick it up for just $23 during the sale. Our 25% off code also applies site-wide, letting you save money on a wide range of popular software. You can grab Windows 10 for $17, Microsoft Office 2019 for only $48, and many more great bargains. Simply type in RGT at the checkout and click apply to instantly get 25% off, and then complete your purchase and the key will be sent to your email within 3 to 5 minutes. As mentioned, Whokeys provides safe, legitimate and verified Windows 10 keys starting at just $17 with our code. And don't forget, of course, if you do purchase Windows 10, it automatically qualifies you to a free upgrade to Windows 11. Additionally, there's Windows and Office packages. They also have a wide selection of Steam games, PlayStation Store gift cards, as well as daily deals. So enjoy an extra 25% off during their Black Friday sale with the code RGT. So again, you can save yourself an extra 25% if you use the coupon code RGT, which you can apply in the checkout process. Thanks very much to Whokeys.com for sponsoring the video, and also thank you if you decide to check out the link in the description. It really does help support the channel, and thanks very much for watching the ad. Clearly we need to start somewhere, and I'll start things out with AMD's Zen 6 processors first. But even if you're only interested in AMD, I would highly suggest suggest you listen to the Intel section as well, because this gets a little complicated, and when you listen to the Intel side of things, it perhaps will shed more light into what's going on. So, in regards to AMD's Zen 6 CPUs, let's start things out with the broad strokes. From my understanding, the Ryzen variants will indeed still be on the AM5 motherboard platform and should essentially be a drop-in upgrade like we've seen with numerous generations in the past, including the recently released Ryzen 9000 series. Kepler-L2 on Twitter states that the date of these processors is scheduled for launch for desktop in late 2026, and this tallies up with what I've been hearing as well. Desktop and potentially server seem to be late 2026, but mobile is looking like it's the first quarter of 2027. Maybe we'll see some type of CES announcement, but that's me just putting words in my source's mouth. So, that's easy, but this is where things get more complicated. And do bear in mind, of course, that none of this is officially confirmed at this point, so we're going off of rumours. AMD seem to be reworking, significantly may I add, the IOD for Zen 6. I've spoken about this in previous videos, but the gist of what we're looking at is kind of like Strix Point Halo APU's Sarlacc. That would serve as one example, with one such SKU in this lineup being called the Ryzen Max Plus 395, according to the prolific leaker Golden Pig upgrade. The specs of this are 40 compute units, 16 Zen 5 cores. That does seem to be accurate. The IOD for Ryzen 10,000, Ryzen X, let me know what you think it's going to be called in the comments below, will improve bandwidth significantly across the board thanks to some of the changes that we're seeing because of Sarlacc. It could almost be thought of as like a prototype Zen 6. This will also mean that GMI, which is a big problem with the current Ryzen processors, specifically the bandwidth, will also increase as well. Now, of course, all of the details haven't leaked yet, but it seems to be utilizing some type of 2.5D packaging for Medusa, and also shares many similarities with RDNA 3's N31/32 packages. So the compute die of N31, of course, the GCD, is tied together with a number of MCDs which form the cache. There are 6 in the case of the higher end N31 GPU. This is accomplished using infinity links, and the bandwidth across the board is north of 5 terabytes per second for RDNA 3. It's highly unlikely, of course, that we'll need those kind of bandwidth figures for the desktop implementation, but still it gives you some idea of what we're looking at. Both the desktop and mobile will fall under Medusa, but there seems to be some small differences between the two, and I've gone on record before though and said that to my knowledge, while there will be architectural improvements to the Zen 6 cores, over Zen 5 I mean, the core and thread count shall remain pretty consistent. So just to be clear, that also means SMT is going to be staying SMT2, so 1 core equal 2 threads. The highest end variants for the desktop, I'd mentioned previously, are going to be 16 cores, potentially with another 4 low power cores on the IOD, but those are only going to be for background tasks, that type of stuff, OS things basically. But there's also Venice, which is a code name associated with Epic, and of course this is going to be for the servers. Also, as a bonus, you may remember the code name of Venice from old AMD 939 Athlon 64 lineups of single core processors from way back in the day. Now, to my understanding, these will feature 16 cores per CCD for the regular, and the dense variants will feature 32 cores per CCD. A LinkedIn leak, or I guess we could say a leaked-in, if you will, seems to indicate that for Zen 6, some of the chips will be using 2nm, probably for the server variants, and others for 3nm. We've seen this already happen with Zen 5. Turin, for example, had its dense variants leveraging 3nm, but other Zen 5 CCDs, which would be found in regular Turin as well as Granite Ridge, utilized 4nm. The key here, though, is that the core counts for Zen 5 CCD in both Turin and Granite Ridge were 8, but the dense variants bumped things up to 16. Now, I have heard some early IPC targets for Zen 6, but quite frankly, the processors are just so far out right now that I think the numbers are fairly meaningless, but I'll mention them anyway. I'm expecting around 10 to 15%, but the problem is, even if these numbers are genuine, and frankly, as with any IPC leak, It's hard to know whether that's true or whether it's a target and it's even achieved. The elephant in the room is we don't know whether these numbers are for server or for desktop. Typically, these numbers which leak, at least early on, are for server, but assume they are legit, will it even translate one-to-one with the desktop? And because of the IOD changes alone for Medusa, but realistically probably the server as well, some workloads could simply see higher performance than that in the real world. This is not for IPC reasons, it's just got more bandwidth to feed the cores. Also, IPC is such a loaded term because different workloads improve performance in different ways. We saw this, for example, with Zen 5. Zen 5 in some applications on Ryzen, it had slight IPC gains, sure, but others were just absolutely nuts. So again, are these loads we're hearing here of 10 to 15% average, or would it be spec in? Or is it tons of different benchmarks I'm throwing together? Well, anyway, as I said, I'll state them just for the sake of completeness. 10 to 15% so far. So where's the problem then? Well, several people have told me that AMD's plans could well have changed. And the reason that these plans may have changed in terms of the core count is Intel. But the takeaway so far is that Intel are considering releasing much higher core counts for the mainstream desktops this time around. So this could mean that AMD, if they're sticking with 16 cores, simply may not be able to compete in multi-thread applications. Now, of course, that isn't to say that it's a one-to-one, because AMD still has SMT on its cores, and it seems that Intel won't. And obviously single thread performance, particularly for something like a game, is also very important. Now, of course, this would also mean that, well, there's several potentials here. The first is that AMD's CCD plans of 8 cores for the Ryzen processors were incorrect initially, or AMD have adjusted its core count and therefore is using the 16 core CCDs for Ryzen as well as server. Basically, they're one and the same. Now, I'm still uncertain whether this is going to happen or not, because there's a ton of questions about this. For example, even with the IOD changes, only 2 channels of DDR5, even if that memory is running faster, would it still be enough to feed all of these cores? I mean, we have seen the Vcache variants of Zen 5X3D perform extremely well in terms of games, obviously depending on the title. So would we still see this happen with Zen 6? Particularly if all of the threads were loaded? I mean, imagine 32 cores, 64 threads potentially. That seems quite a lot. The rumour for the old core count, therefore, could be incorrect. And it was 16 core CCD all along. But frankly, I'm somewhat skeptical of this. I still think that 16 cores for Ryzen next generation makes sense. Or maybe an 8-core CCD for Medusa was planned, but scrapped in favour of the higher core counts because of Intel. But then there are other questions. How big would the package itself be to accommodate all of these cores? And would that even fit in a desktop platform? There's also potentially some confusion between Medusa desktop and the laptop variants, plus other variants of these processors. Maybe also the rumour is of higher core counts because of the low power cores, which allegedly will be on the IOD. Therefore, people are just pretty much extrapolating and saying higher core count. Well, that must mean the double cores, the 16 core CCD is probably what's being used in Ryzen. Or the higher core count rumours are just completely wrong. So far, that's somewhat the direction that I'm leaning in, and I still think that 16/0/4 configuration is probably true, and therefore, initially, I wasn't even going to make this video, because, quite frankly, I think we've heard the reports of AMD are totally raising the core counts for Ryzen guys before, but, well, the problem is that after I initially just pretty much poo-pooed this idea, there were some other rumours that started to come up, and this is courtesy of Intel plus some other sources. So let's move on to Intel, shall we, since they've been in the corner there like a big elephant. Their next generation parts for desktop are known as Nova Lake, and they sport Coyote Cove, which will be the performance cores, and Arctic Wolf for its E cores. The desktop client parts, allegedly, I'm speaking to several sources at this point, will continue the trend of not featuring hyperthreading. So, 1 performance core equals 1 thread. So this is where things get kind of weird. I had a source reach out to me quite recently. In fact, they initiated contact, and this is where the rabbit hole really began. I'll get into what they asked in just a second, but I think that before we go further, it's important for me to just go over the very basics of Intel's tile and packaging concepts. Now, for the sake of simplicity, you can think of their CPU compute tile as an AMD CCD. Now, there are certainly some differences, but just for the ease of the portion of this video, I suggest you would perhaps later on read up more about Arrow Lake's design and other Intel manufacturing details, but you can scrape by the rest of this video just with that kind of information. So anyway, the first source that I was, contacted me, they asked me if I was familiar with this discussion over Anantech. I then asked them, well, do you know if any of this information is correct? Because they've been pretty accurate on several things before, and they backed up several points. They also provided some extra details on this post, and so that led me to start speaking to a few other people. Now, unfortunately, as is common with this type of thing, some folks were able to confirm some things, but they didn't know other things, and so on and so forth. For example, in the post here, it mentions the memory speeds for Nova Lake, which none of my sources could verify as they simply did not know the speeds right now. Logically, it would make sense for Nova Lake to have faster memory support, because that's typically what happens with subsequent generations, but again, I couldn't get it confirmed. This post also mentions that there's a higher core count for the Ryzen Zen 6 parts, interestingly, but there was no core count information. So again, I don't know whether this backs up what I've been told by other people, or whether this is simply not correct, or maybe it's because, yes, there are two 8-core CCDs, but there's also the 4 cores and the IOD, and again, that's how people are getting confused. So it becomes a little complicated, but up until this point, I was very convinced that for the desktop, for Zen, we would see 16 cores, and we would see potentially the 4 little cores and the IOD again for the background tasks. But in the post on Anantech, they also stated the core count is higher for Nova Lake than the 8 plus 32 canned Arrow Lake SKU. Now, I had been told by a source that the compute tile for Intel's Nova Lake is allegedly 8 plus 16, with 8 of the performance cores and 16 being Arctic Wolf. By the way, complete side note, whenever I hear Arctic Wolf, I just think of Metal Gear Solid 1's Sniper Wolf. Is it just me? Now, I was also told that yes, there is a cache tile present. Now, I'm uncertain if this is for all models or some specific variants. I think given the context, plus this post here, plus just logic of what we're seeing with AMD, for example, it's probably certain SKUs or maybe the highest end SKUs. But either way, I was told that yes, the cache is 144 megabytes. To be clear here, it does seem to be a completely separate tile, just like AMD. So it isn't part of the compute die, it's essentially completely separate, so a compute die could be used for a non-cache version of Nova Lake or one of these 144 megabyte cache versions of Nova Lake. Okay, so we have 8 plus 16 cores, nothing too exciting, but this is where things get quite intriguing. Because I've heard that Intel can plonk 2 of these tiles, does this sound familiar? Does it sound anything like Ryzen, guys? Onto their flagship desktop parts. So obviously, this would mean 16/32 cores. Now it's worth noting that from what my understanding is so far, the cache is only connected to a single tile. We'll call it tile A, and tile B does not feature this cache. Now this could change, or this information could be wrong, but it seems again very similar, to the basic principle of, let's say, AMD's Ryzen 7950X 3D cache, at least in concept, but obviously there are a lot of changes under the hood. I'm also told that yes, there are some changes how the NGU, or Next Generation Uncore, does function, but I don't know the specifics. I was told that yes, there are some big improvements to reduce bandwidth contention, improve latencies, yada yada yada, but I don't know how any of this works. It does seem to be backed up again with this Anantech post, but I don't have any extra details on how the iGPU is connected or any of that stuff. I've also very little information at this stage on IPC, clock frequencies or anything like that. This becomes even more convoluted with Intel, because at least with AMD, well, you know, on most AMD products anyway, there's only one type of core. So for example, Zen 4 or Zen 5. But with Intel, you've got the P and the E cores. So you have to ask, is the IPC gains for the E core? Is it for the P core? Is it a combination of both? And then of course, is that an average workload? Is it a specific workload? And so on and so on. However, as a couple of little extras, I was told that Arctic Wolf, which again are the E cores, does sound very interesting, and actually the decode is wider than Skymont. I wasn't given a specific number, only that its performance will show a very impressive uptick, potentially impressing some more than the P cores. And that doesn't mean that the E cores are going to outperform the P cores, it just means that the E cores are going to be really impressive. Additionally, the P cores seem to be somewhat clustered together. I have slightly mixed information on this, but I believe the L1 caches are still private, so each core has its own L1. The P cores, though, are lumped together, and they are lumped together in groups of 2, which each of these groups having a shared L2 cache. I was told by one source it was 4 megabytes, and another source told me it was equal to or greater than Lion Cove by another. Now, it is worth noting that Intel themselves have confirmed that a large last level cache is going to be coming to their processors, albeit they mentioned specifically this is going to be for server, which is going to of course release in 2025. And this is actually from Florian Maslinger. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. I get the feeling I just butchered that terribly. This is actually an interview with De Bauer. I will leave a link to this in the video description. I actually spotted it from Hardware Lux, and thanks to the person on Discord that actually linked me this, so that's very nice of them. But basically speaking, they state that the company is working on a new server workstation processor for 2025, and it's going to have basically this last level cache, and it's going to be shared across its server processors. Now, they don't specifically rule out the desktop. In fact, what they are basically saying is that the products are going to release first for server, and then in subsequent years it will eventually start to roll out for desktop, which pretty much does mean that Intel are at the very least considering this, which actually, if anything, at least in my personal opinion, does add more credibility to the Nova Lake leaks. Now, this is speculation on my part. This is not part of the information that I've received, but potentially we will see Intel release the Nova Lake processors without the cache tile first, and later on, maybe several months afterwards, much like we've seen with AMD, they will start to roll out the cache tile in addition to that in their lineup. And it's also one last thing I want to mention on this. While I have joked around a couple of times in the video that AMD are of course being copied by Intel, that's not technically true. Intel have had quite a long history of buggering around with large caches on their processors in one form or another for many, many years. I think it goes back, someone correct me in the comments below, but I think it was like 2000 and, I don't know guys, like very early 2010s or maybe like late 2007 or 8, something like that, they were messing around with this type of stuff. It just hasn't been in the mainstream, particularly when it comes to the desktop side of things. In fact, Intel, if you go back far enough, they were screwing around with different caches, like way back in the days of like the Pentium Pros and stuff like that, albeit obviously a very different technology, and it's not even slightly the same as what we're talking about here. I'm just saying that Intel have been buggering around with cache in one form or another. So again, although I am joking around that they're copying one another, I'm mostly just saying this just so you can get an idea of what how the technology relates to AMD. But again, Intel's packaging and general stuff is quite different from AMD. There's just a lot of similarities in the basic concept, which is kind of what I'm trying to get everyone onto the same page. And then again, I would highly recommend you do your own research for this. When I asked the first source again if they truly believed that Intel would up the core count, because again, this is a lot of cores, guys. They basically told me Intel were definitely considering releasing a chip, But they also caveated this by reminding me that Intel have certainly not been shy cancelling products in the past. Remember, again, there was the 8 plus 32 core Arrow Lake processor, and that was definitely on the cards early on. I mean, I've seen literal documentation about it, but it was canned. And Intel have stated numerous times at this point that it is simplifying its product lineup. You could basically say that Intel are just getting absolutely hammered across multiple product segments. So the question is, would releasing this chip actually make sense commercially for Intel or not? On one hand, it would probably give them the product leadership for multi-threading, well, potentially, depending on AMD's reaction, of course. But on the other hand, how many people would actually buy one of these things? The challenges regarding power consumption, the packaging, heat output, price, and so on and so forth. With that said, for both Zen 6 Desktop and Nova Lake S, it seems that both are on collision course for launching again in Q4 2026. So it's going to be very interesting to see if any of this is true. So what are my thoughts here, guys? Do I think that Intel and AMD will be raising the core counts for their next generation processors? Well, when it comes to Intel, I would not be surprised at all if at the very least they have been working on this stuff internally. Again, it's pretty much known at this point that Intel have had a plethora of different processors that have been cancelled, like again, the 32 core E Arrow Lake processor is pretty much, of course, now known to have existed at one time or another and then was canned. So I certainly wouldn't be surprised if Intel are at least considering releasing this absolutely behemoth of a CPU. The problem is whether Intel will actually do it for all of the reasons I've mentioned throughout the video. For one, is there even a need for it in terms of the consumer space right now? And also, just with all of the internal struggles that Intel have had, I don't know. With that said, I think it would be absolutely brilliant if they did do it, but I'll be curious to see how it performs in various different scenarios in terms of just memory bandwidth and so on and so on. As for AMD, personally, I'm not convinced that AMD will raise the core counts beyond 16 for the next generation of Ryzen. I have had some sources, like I said throughout the video, who have said this, plus there's an Anantech post that also indicates that at the very least it seems to be considered, but all of my best sources so far are telling me it's 8 plus 8. So there's 2 CCDs with 8 cores each, so I personally don't have much hope. Would I love for them to raise it? Yes, I think it would be absolutely brilliant. I think it would be super fun. However, I think personally there's just wires being crossed because of the multiple different forms of CCD which are going to be taking place for Zen 6. So I think that there is just a lot of room for confusion. With that said, there are certainly crazier things that have happened, and if Intel does release this higher core count processor, I wouldn't be surprised if AMD at the very least considered it, assuming they would even have room on the actual Ryzen package for this thing. And because we don't actually have the measurements for the CCD, we could make some estimates. But even with estimates, it's quite difficult to know because we don't know all of the changes, plus we don't know the size of the IOD and other stuff that's going to be on the processor. So you could make some estimates and say, well, we know that the core sizes for this processor are X, and we know that it's using Y manufacturing process. And so if we infer this with the next generation and it's using this process, you could probably make some guesstimates, but even then it's not necessarily one-to-one. So it'll be very interesting to see if AMD does it. Again, I personally don't have much hope for it, but Intel, maybe. That said, single thread performance for most of us is possibly more important anyway, particularly when it comes to things such as gaming. So as for Zen 7 onwards, I wouldn't be surprised if they did consider raising the core counts. But I guess we'll just wait and see, because that's certainly a long way off. That's, of course, if it even is called Zen at that point. With that said, guys, take care of yourselves. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.